Hey, welcome to Bible Bites, everybody. I'm Pastor Dan, and we are reading through the Bible one small bite at a time. So today we're in Matthew 14 and beginning here in verse 13, reading the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000, which many have heard of, even those who know little about Jesus or the Bible. So let's dive in here. When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. In our last video, if you watched that, you will recall that John the Baptist had just died. Now, John the Baptist and Jesus were carrying out similar ministry. John was actually preparing the people's hearts to receive Jesus and the teaching of Jesus. But John the Baptist was also not just a co-laborer with Jesus, but was Jesus' cousin, his blood cousin. So this had a impact, it deeply moved Jesus, no doubt, that his cousin had died. And so Jesus tries to retreat away from the crowds and the people. He wants to grieve. He needs some space. And yet, what we see here is it states that hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. Well, let's keep going here. Verse 14 says, When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. We don't really know that Jesus got much time alone. Probably didn't really get to grieve much. And I think that this is important because so often when we need me time, right? When we need to rest, when we are weary and tired, burdened by something, and God asks us to put aside that grieving, to put aside a focus on self, to carry out His purposes and plans. It is very difficult. And so I think even this idea of Jesus having this compassion, he had to really be others focused. And so he had to deny his flesh. He really did. And I think God calls us to that, perhaps more than we are willing to admit. But I think that's what we're seeing here. And Jesus did that. He put aside self to be focused on others, to minister and carry out the purposes of God. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, This is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food. So the disciples are just confiding in Jesus, counseling Jesus, maybe is a word you could use there, about what is going on. So Jesus is busy with the people, teaching, and yet the disciples are able to kind of pull him aside and just say, hey, it's really getting late. I wonder if we ought to just send the people home before they get so hungry that the trip becomes really a burdensome to them, or they get too weary. They're probably fairly far out from town, so it wasn't an insignificant walk back to the villages that they came from. So the disciples are noticing this, presenting it to Jesus, and probably are pretty surprised at Jesus' response here in 16. Jesus replied, They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat. And I can almost picture the disciples being like, well, we only have these 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. They aren't going to go far enough. So how did you expect us to feed the people? And Jesus was preparing his disciples, wasn't he? And largely this miracle perhaps was for them. It was a preparation. And God, the Spirit of Christ, prepares us, and whatever we go through, whatever fire we're going through, whatever challenging circumstances we're going through, I think God does prepare us. He teaches us. There's lessons to be learned. Perhaps he's deconstructing mentalities that we have and rebuilding it with a God-centered mentality or a God mindset. And Jesus really wanted to see the disciples that they could lean upon God for whatever they needed to carry out his plans and his purposes. And surely that's a lesson that we all need to learn. Bring them here to me, he said. And he directed the people to sit down on the grass, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was 5,000 men, besides women and children. So we find out that the feeding of the 5,000 was actually more than that. They just numbered the men, and probably this was just an estimate. It's possible they counted, but my guess would be this is probably an estimate. And yet, so what we see is God providing well above and beyond what is needed. And that was always the case with Jesus, wasn't it? He always provided what was needed to carry out, or he always did what was needed, and God was providing what was needed so that the plans and, again, the purposes of God were carried out. And Jesus was very God-focused in that way. It was always all about Jesus. And that too is something that we keep in mind as we journey here on this earth, that it really is all about God, not about our happiness. Though it's not that God doesn't want us to be happy. I think he wants us to be happy, but yet can we find our happiness in the things and the purposes of God, not in this world? All right, hopefully that was a great read for you today. You learned a few things about hearing this story of the life of Jesus, and we will catch you in our next video. Until then, be blessed.